So we've talked about plant species. I want to spend a little time talking more specifically about what we mean by plant species. So we talked about the natural selection reason for there to be different plant species, kind of generally about plants taking on new strategies. That's very interesting from the plant's perspective. Obviously, this plant species is different from its ancestor, its close relatives, different in ways that that matter to it. Now, the other kind of a whole different perspective on this, a lot of people want to know what a plant is without thinking too deeply about why it's different from anybody else. So they don't have to know why a plant has different color petals or why it's growing in a different habitat necessarily, or why its leaves are different. A big part of botany, and probably what you're interested in learning for this course, is just being able to know one species from another. And so what we're interested in are features that can be used to tell different species from each other. So I have a selection here of plants in the genus Ranunculus, the buttercup genus. And just in this group, you can see the difference in numbers of petals. We've got 5 petals and 5 petals and more than 5 petals, about 10 there, 8 petals on this one. Differences in the shape here. We've got these broad petals in this species and rather narrow petals in this species. And so these are features that we'd be able to potentially use to tell these plants apart. One thing I guess I'll warn you about here is that we also have to take into account variation. So if you're actually going to use the shape of the petal to tell Ranunculus acris from Ranunculus flammula, you need to be able to tell them apart consistently. Like this set of petals would always be bigger in every case than the petals you would find on this species. And that's something we'll get to in a little later lecture as well. So I have it here, diagnosable, basically something you can look at or have the right tools to investigate and know that it's different from its neighbors. So there's lots of variation, as I suggested here. Some members of this species, Ranunculus ficaria on the left and Ranunculus flammula on the right. They're not always the same sheen, the same tint of yellow, and so on. But as I said, so you want to know what is always present. So for example, on the right here, we've got mostly 5 petals. This one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 petals. A fluke on that one. I'd say 5 is pretty normal here. And in this group, consistently more than 5, more than 6. The minimum appears to be 8 in the images that I've got here. And then we've got it up to more than 10, I think. So there's some variation between these two species that's consistent. This is what's known as interspecific variation between species, and then within a species is known as intraspecific. And typically, when you're using a guide to identify plants, someone has done the work for you ahead of time and determined that this sort of have an understanding of the variation within a species and the variation that's important and always different between species. So we're going to spend a lot of time in this class on phylogenetics, the concept of basically making phylogenies and interpreting phylogenies. And we've seen them before, this pattern of drawing them with a single ancestor farther back, and then consistent dichotomous branching. So 1 becomes 2. And that's a pretty consistent expectation when you make a phylogeny, is 1 becomes 2, and 1 becomes 2, and 1 becomes 2. So it over time increases the number of lineages that we have, and they usually terminate in plants that are growing today. So plants that are all alive today, those are the ones at the right here, and highlighting with images of their flowers seen from the side, so you can see some variation in size, shape, color, all the things that we often use to identify different plant species. So shows a pattern of speciation. We talked about it as diversification before. Speciation is the idea of making a new species. So starting from 1 species, ending up with 2 species. Diversification we already talked about before. And the concept of diversification describes not only the increase in number of species, but also increase in diversity of strategies. So morphology or habitat ecology. I've been using this term lineage. So lineage comes from the word for line. You might have heard about it in like human ancestry, the line of descent. You have a line of descent. You can kind of connect yourself to your grandparents and great-grandparents through a line. So lineage, when I use that term in phylogenetics, it's basically the individual species that derived from one ancestor. So this lineage is kind of defined by this line, but it's this line that becomes all these lines. So you can refer to all of these as a lineage. They've all got this I prefix that means they belong to the same genus. And then they have maybe some similarity that you could match within this group that's different from everybody else that's shown on here in their form of flowers. All right, so we're going to use these terms over and over again. You hopefully will get very familiar with them as we go. Another principle of phylogenetics is shared ancestry. So looking backwards from any one of these individual species, it has ancestry shared with everything on this tree. And the question often becomes, how recent was its common ancestor? So if you take two species, these two have the prefix D for one genus, and their common ancestor is back here to 13 and 14. But 14 also has a common ancestor with 15. So you have to trace that back. The question of common ancestor, you can get at that by basically connecting the lines. So if we want to know the distance in the past to the common ancestor of 14 and 15, I'll go back. And at this location, this is the farthest back we have to go to connect 14 to 15. And so this would be the common ancestor, the most recent common ancestor of species 14 and species 15. And then we can go from that to 15 or from that to 14. So I mentioned morphology, features that we use to tell species apart. One of the features that can be helpful for grouping species, we want to tell them apart, but also be able to categorize them into groups. So putting them into categories usually involves finding a trait that is shared between the species that you're interested in categorizing. And there's this term called synapomorphy, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it means basically a feature that's shared within a group, and it's shared because it was inherited from their common ancestor. So took a rather extravagant example here. This is a group of flowers called passion flowers. Genus is Passiflora. And they have lots of features that are rare among flowering plants and pretty consistent within passion flowers. So their petals are actually back here in the background, petal, petal, petal. And then they have this fringe of what's called a corona. So kind of a different flower feature than we've talked about before, a very modified structure, present here, 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 different shapes and colors, but present in all. And then the arrangement of their reproductive part, they've got these stamens that are a thick filament with this sideways anther, same thing here, anther, anther. And a really different feature is that the ovary is actually held up on a stalk in this group. So ovary with 3 stigmas, ovary, 3 stigmas up on a stalk, ovary here. So those lots of features in common. Even a novice, I think, would be able to look at these plants and say, those belong to the same group. They have so many features that are shared between them that's different from other kinds of flowers. So when it comes to classification, most of the classification work has been done for you by the time you get to any groups that you're interested in, but it's also an ongoing question. How do we classify groups? And so looking for these synapomorphies, or described here as apomorphies, those are features that can be useful for grouping plants together. So if we're looking at a similar graph to what we saw before, where these lines are new traits that are arising. And the new traits, if they arise on a branch, they can be inherited by everything that descended from that ancestor. So it kind of comes around to features that are easy to identify or useful. The ones that are more obvious or more easy to use when classifying. So we got 1, 2, 3 features that 1 or more of those might be useful for saying C and B belong to the same group. Same thing over here. We've got just 1 feature here. This is an apomorphy that is shared by D, E, and F. or at least present in their ancestor. And that might be useful for classifying those together. So we talked about classification as hierarchical. You can look at small groups of species. E and F might share this feature, and bigger groups of species. So if we go farther down, there's this ancestral apomorphy that could be shared by B, C, D, E, F. So we can classify small groups, E, F, or big groups that all share common ancestry within their groups. So as we're choosing the features that might be useful, it's not guaranteed that an ancestral feature is inherited by everybody. Sometimes those features change again over time. But if they are present in most of the members of the lineage or all the members of the lineage, those are very useful traits. And also if you're not finding them in other groups. So the rare features we saw in the passion flowers, those are not going to be found in other groups outside of the passion flowers, as far as I know, at least the combination of features together. So that ends up being a useful trait.